Welcome to our Tuesday sew-along. Tonight we're going to be doing block number 45. It's called Four Kings. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I've moved some projects around today for classes that are coming up. I don't have them scheduled yet, but I did want to share with you some things we have coming up. So first of all, over on the wall, if you've been in the shop lately, there's several projects over on the wall. The Christmas one was actually a project called Beekeepers, and it was made out of yellow and black fabric in the pattern, but I chose Christmas prints, little whimsical Christmas prints. Then we'll also offer the Christmas tree skirt called Snow Crystals, and Feathered Star will be another option, and the Morning Star. So those are options that are over on that wall, so be looking for those schedules. And then behind me, there's some little blocks called Ribbons from a little quilt. That's a layer cake project, so that's something coming up. So just so you remember, just because you aren't local doesn't mean you can't take a class with us, because the classes run at the same time. I'm trying to tighten this up and it's not working very well. The classes you can do via Zoom or in person here at the shop. So there'll be more information about that as well. And this fall, we have a couple of visiting teachers that are going to be offering some things here at the shop. So there will be more information about that as that gets closer. So we've got several people joining us. I want to show you our block for tonight. It's called Four Kings, and it's got some square and a square units, these right here, so that we have a center with two different colors for your side triangles. And then the center of the block is also a square and a square. Keep in mind that the center square in your square and a square unit does not have to be a plain solid square like this one. This one actually has a four patch in the center. So you're going to put together some oversized squares, and then because we're using the square squared tool to trim this to the proper size, I've already stitched together my four patch, and we're going to talk about how you get that center part. So we're going to do that part second. We're going to start with this square squared unit where we have different colors for our side triangles. So remember, when you're doing a square in a square unit, you're after a specific measurement from point to point. But that means that the measurement for the size square you need to cut is often a really odd measurement. Sometimes that measurement isn't even something that you find on a traditional ruler. So the tool gives us a window template to cut the precise size square we need for the center. And on my tool, I've actually marked that the A section and the trim down section, the B section. If you happen to own the large square squared unit, it comes with two different pieces of plastic, and it's marked A section, B section. But I just took a Sharpie and marked it on my tool. There's something else that is helpful. There's a chart right along the side that tells me what size squares to cut that I'm then going to cut in half to be the surrounding triangles. Also, there's a couple of really nice marks for you that are going to be handy when we're doing the center square to square. But this tells me if I'm doing a 3-inch finished square squared, that's what this one is, I would use the center square for 3-inch finished blocks, and it tells me to start with a 2 3/4 inch strip. So that's what I have here. You could actually use squares, but since I'm just doing plain center squares, I'm going to start from a strip, and I'm going to, when I get this on here, it's going to kind of disappear. I think I'll turn this inside out so you can see a little better, because with that dark fabric, it's hard to see once you get the ruler on there, because the lines kind of disappear. So I want to trim this to the size of this window template. So I'm going to put the bottom of my center square for 3-inch blocks on the bottom of that strip. Let me find a cutter, and I'm going to cut up. We're just going to carefully move that over, and I'm going to cut across the top because I'm truing up this strip to the right size square. So once I get that done, I'm just going to put the center square for the 3-inch finished block on the cut edges here and here, and that'll line up across the top. And once I cut that, I've got the perfect square for the center of my unit. And it'll go right there in the middle of all of those triangles. We'll talk about those in a minute. When I picked this up and moved it, do you see how my strip separated? So I'm just going to flip this over and do it a couple more times because this is what it would look like if you had a bunch to cut. I've got the first side cut here from when I was cutting those squares, and I would just cut up and then across the top. That automatically gives me the precise square I need, and I would just keep doing that till I have the number of squares I need for my block. And this block actually needs 4 center squares for these 3-inch squared units. So I've got 4 of them here. And then I've got some squares I need. For each one of these squares, I need a red square and a background square. So since I have 4 center squares, I have 4 red squares and 4 background squares. I'm just going to grab a cutting tool that I can line point to point, and I can cut those, and I'm going to do that with all 4 of them. So there's those. Let's do the background ones. This is review. If you've been watching very long, you've probably seen me make squared units. You've probably seen me even make the economy block, which is a double square and a square. You have other things you can do. It's a good way to feature something in the center. You could fussy cut something. You could applicate something. So you have lots of different options that you could do. So I'm going to go over to the sewing area. And I'm going to peel up a piece of tape that I put on here, and we'll add that back and I'll explain it in a minute. Oh, here is my sections. I've got my red triangles, my background triangles, and I've got a stack of my squares for the center. Let me get this to focus maybe. It's being contrary. There we go. Sometimes when I have take a break like we did last week, I come back and it just doesn't play nice. So I need 2 of my red squares, triangles that I cut from my square, and 2 of my background. So that's what I'm putting around that center square. What I'm going to do is just grab one of them, and I want to sew with the square on top and the triangle on bottom. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the square is cut to the size it needs to be when I finish. The triangle is oversized. So that's what I want to put on bottom so I can pay attention to the edge of my square. Plus, if there's any extra fullness, I want that on the bottom next to the feed dog because the feed dogs helps pull my fabric through. Now, I'm actually using an even feed program system on my machine, and your machine may have that as well. So that helps with the situation, but it is a handy thing to have. So I'm going to do a couple of them at a time. I'm going to grab another red triangle and stitch onto that. And I didn't talk about when I very first started, I actually had a fabric tag, just a piece of fabric. I changed bobbins and I didn't close the door, and it doesn't like that. So you just want to park your needle. We're just going to park my needle here, and I've got a couple of these under here. So I'm going to just finger press this back. You don't want to be real heavy-handed because the edge of my red triangle is a bias edge. So I don't want to pull anything out of line. And I'm just finger pressing little short creases on my triangle. Now I want to stitch the opposite triangle in place. So I don't want to use my red triangle because it has to touch the first red triangle. So I've got to change to the opposite color for this color arrangement. And I'm going to line those up. And we're going to place that under and let the feed dogs just pull that through. And I'm watching the edge of my square just to make sure everything's all lined up the way I want it to. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. I have to have the opposite color for the color arrangement I'm using for this particular block. And of course you can use whatever color you want. These are just basic shapes for you to play with. And of course, if I was doing all 4 of them, I would just keep feeding them through. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to do a couple of them because I want to get to the next part here in a minute. So I've got 2 triangles on my center square, and I'm going to finger press this as well. Just give it a little crease. If you were making 100 of these, you might want to take the whole stack to the ironing board and press them all. But since I'm just doing a couple of them, I finger press them, and I'm just going to grab the next triangle. It doesn't really matter whether I grab a red one first or a background triangle first, but I've got to have one of each for the other 2 sides of my center square. And I'm just aligning on the edge. My presser foot is riding right along the edge of that square because I'm using a patchwork foot that basically is a 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the needle. So I'm just going to stitch that on. Once I get 2 or 3 stitches in, I've got my needle in the down position, so it stops with it, the needle down in the fabric. That holds everything in place so that I can adjust and keep the fabric right along the edge of my presser foot. So then I'm just going to grab my little piece of fabric and part my needle. And then I'm going to grab a background triangle now. So you can go ahead and press this back, finger press it. It doesn't really matter though, because I can just add another triangle without finger pressing first. And I'll show you when that would not be a good idea here in just a minute. I'm lining up again, sewing right along the edge of the center square. One more. So when we get this done, we're going to be ready to press this and trim it with our squared tool. We're just going to line up right along the edge of our presser foot. Of course, I would be making 4 of these if I was doing the whole block. I'm just going to grab that, part my needle, and I'm ready to go to the pressing station. And I'll show you what I was talking about when I said you don't necessarily have to finger press first. So here is my unit, and notice that I've got my second set of triangles. The first set, you have to press it back before you add the second set. But as long as you don't overlap this triangle enough that it catches in the seam, it doesn't have to be finger pressed or even pressed back until you get both of them on. So I've got that ready. I'm going to set the iron on it, let the iron do the work to give it a little bit of a heat. And I'm going to grab the other one. This is when, if you're using the acorn pressing pin, you just give it a quick swipe. And I'm doing all 4 seams because I didn't do it after the first 2 triangles. So I'll add that. So there is my squared unit with my triangles all added. And now I'm going to use the B section of my tool to trim this up. so that I have the precise seam allowance I need all the way around this squared unit. So this is a 3-inch finished unit. I've got a couple of threads in the seam. We're just going to peel those out of there. But that is going to line up with all the X's that say 3. That's your finished size, all of those X's. I'm actually trimming this to a 3.5-inch square. But the number 3 indicates where those intersections should come, where the triangles overlap. So I'm just going to slide that under there, and I just want to center that on there. Now, if you're right-handed, you're going to hold your ruler horizontal like mine is. If you're left-handed, you simply turn it vertical like this. And then you line up those same X's on the intersections, and you cut up the left side and across the top. I'm not even going to try that. So I'm going to line that up here, and once I get all of those intersections lined up on the number 3, I'm ready to trim. So there's another set, and I'm going to do that again. And I of course would need 4 of these for my block. Once you get that done, you're ready to trim the next one. It automatically leaves me with the seam allowance that's appropriate here, so that when I stitch the next seam across, it should hit right at that tip. And I shouldn't chop off the points of my square in a square. So that's one thing that gives us the look of precision that we're after. So let's talk about how I did this one. It's the same basic idea, except that I've made a 4-patch to go in the center. And remember, my size of my square is measured from point to point. Now, of course, I could do a little funky math and come up with that number, but like I said, it's often a measurement that's not even on a traditional ruler. So I've got it oversized. I'm going to turn my tool around. With the A section, I need this to be trimmed to the center for a 6-inch block, and that's this window template here. So the other thing that is going to help me is I have a long diagonal line through the center of all those squares. That diagonal line needs to hit right on the intersection of my 4-patch. If you happen to have a squared tool that doesn't have that center line and doesn't have these little slash marks, you might consider updating to the newer squared, and it's been out for a long time. So I'm guessing probably most everybody has this newer one with the diagonal line. I'm going to turn this so you can see that line. So it doesn't really matter which color you would put that under, but because I want you to be able to see that diagonal line running right through the center of my 4-patch, I turned it. I also have these little slash marks, and they're the center point of that side of the square. So I'm lining up those little slash marks right on the seams, and I've got the diagonal line running through the center, and I'm going to make my 2 first cuts, and then I'm going to turn. This time I'm lining up with the bold line here on the edge of the center square for 6-inch finished blocks. Again, I have the diagonal line running right through the center, and I have all of those little slash marks on the seams so that they are right in line with the very center of the side of that square. Now I also need the triangle, so I've got 2 oversized squares. I'm just going to grab a cutting tool that I can line up point to point and cut those into triangles. So I'm ready to take this to the sewing area and stitch those on. So this is where I'm headed with that. So I had a bit of a panic attack when I first turned on the machine tonight because there was no sound. I don't know why the computer decided to reset itself and it turned all the sound off. So I fiddled with it enough that I finally got it working again. Sad thing is I really don't know for sure what I did to get it to come on, but we have sound, so we're good. So I'm just lining up this triangle on the side, and I just kind of eyeball it and center it on there. I don't have to fuss with it. If you've done very much quilting, you've probably run across a pattern that says fold your triangle and pinch it, or even give it a little snip and do that with your square and then match those up. You don't have to do that with this method. I even cut a little notch in there so you can see what I'm talking about. But you just kind of eyeball it and center it on there because you don't have to be fussy. You're going to trim it to the precise size you really need when you're done. So I'm lining up on the long side of my triangle, and I'm going to stitch off of my fabric tag onto that center square. And I stitched enough stitches that I can just stop, and the needle is in the down position so I can adjust any issues on the side of my square. So once you get that done, I'm going to grab my fabric tag and part my needle. You only need one of these for this block, so unless you're making several of these blocks, you just have to do this once. So again, you just center it on there just by eye. I try to make sure that I have an equal amount of the triangle sticking out on both sides of the square. It's going to be trimmed, so if one's just a hair bigger than the other, it still will work just fine. It just makes it easier if you have, try to just make it equal. So I'm just lining up along the long edge. And I didn't talk about when I did the 4-patch, but I will show you when I put the 4-patch together, I twizzled the center so that the stitches or the seams all followed each other around the center. That helps this center point of my 4-patch lay down nice and flat. That's particularly nice if you like to hand quilt, or even if you're a long arm quilter or like to machine quilt. Your machine likes it better when it's flat. It can go over things that kind of have a hump, but it likes it better if it lays down nice and flat. So I'm just going to center this triangle on the remaining side. And notice I did finger press the first set of triangles back before I added this one. If you don't finger press the first set of triangles back, you're going to have to get your seam ripper, because it just has to line up. You want to make sure that you don't trap any of the seams or the triangles down. So I'm going to grab my fabric tag and park it one more time. And then I'm going to center this one on the side. I just want basically an equal amount on both ends of my triangle. And adjust that. Once I get this side stitched, I'm ready to press and trim. So this is a 6-inch center unit. So I need to trim it to 6.5 inches. And we're ready to go to the ironing board. So let me show you what this will look like. The first thing I'm going to do is finger press it. Get yourself in a habit of finger pressing your seams as you bring them to your iron. You'll be much more precise because that will make sure that the seams go the direction they need to go and you don't end up with little tucks or folds. You can see that my mat is a little bit of a dome, so it kind of wants to slide on me. But that is ready to trim. This one needs to be 6.5 inches, and that's the largest size I can make with the original square squared. There are a couple of other options. One is the large square squared, and it will do from 1 inch to 12 inch. This one will do from 1 inch to 6 inch. These are finished sizes. And there is one, a newer one, that is a half size. So it'll do 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, finished sizes. So now I'm looking for all of the numbers that say 6 that have those X's, and that's what's going on my intersections. And I just center them on there, and I'm going to trim up and across the top, and then I'm going to turn and line up. This one actually is the size of my ruler, because from the bottom to the top of my ruler is 6.5 inches. And this line right here will make sure that I'm trimming it to a 6.5 inch square that will finish at 6 inches. So there's my center 6-inch finished unit for the center of my block. And it'll go right here. So I'm going to move a couple of things because I want you to see what's on the side. This is the side of my block. And I just have plain squares in the corner. I've got my square squared in the center where I had 2 different colors of triangles. Now I'm going to make some pickets. There is a technique sheet called Pickets and Quickets. There's a way to do this that if you're making, I think it's block number, oh goodness, it's one of the blockbusters. I don't remember the number, about 4, where they did Pickets and Quickets. No, it was block 5. We did Pickets and Quickets, and we did one side starting with the technique where you make a couple of flying geese, and with your leftover you make one of these, and the other one we did with the method I'm going to show you for today. So I have a stack. They're cut oversized. I have some rectangles. I'm going to do that on here so you can actually see it. I have some rectangles and some squares. So I'm going to show you how I did this. I find it to be the quickest way for making these picket units. So you have a couple of options, and I'll talk about them and I'll show you what I actually did. So I have my stack of squares, and you can grab your Quilter's Magic Wand and a marking tool, and I only need one line. Normally, if we're using the Magic Wand, we're putting the etched line corner to corner, and we're drawing a line on both sides of the Quilter's Magic Wand. We do that when we're making flying geese and when we're making half squares or quarter squares or combination squares. But when we're making pickets and quickets, we only need one line. Kind of the folded corner idea. So I'm just going to draw one line. And I'll show you what I actually did. Gotta find the right marking tool. So all I have to do is grab my rectangle and line up my square. I think I'm going to do 2 of these just to show you another consideration. So I've got my square. I'm going to draw a line across. So I've got my line on both of my squares. And I've got my rectangles. Now I want to show you what would happen. I'm going to look and see. I don't know if you can see my line. I should have done it with a darker marking tool. I've got both of my rectangles with the line leaning the same way. But I don't know if you noticed, but I have to have a mirror image. One has to lean left and one has to lean right. Let me get a darker marking tool because I want you to be able to see that so you're not confused about this. You have to have one leaning left, and this one's laying on here, but it's leaning the same way. In order to get that mirror image, every pair you have to have one leaning left and one leaning right. So you want to make sure that you have the appropriate number of left leaning and the appropriate number of right leaning in order for them to work on your project. So notice one got fed through with the extra blue fabric on this side. This one the extra blue fabric is going to be on the right side. So I know for sure I've got a pair that are opposite when I've done that way. So that's step number one. You want to make sure that some are leaning left and some are leaning right when you feed them through. The other thing that I want to show you that I actually did when I did this process, and a lot of times when I'm making a folded corner or a picket, I do this. So I'm just going to put a piece of painter's tape on my sewing table, and I can use either my Quilter's Magic Wand, and I need to lift my presser foot. My needle is in the down position. Let me move this where you can see what I'm doing. And it's just not playing nice. It's wanting to move on me. My needle is in the down position. There we go. And I want to make sure that whatever I'm using to draw my line against is straight with the bed of my machine. I can line up with these vertical lines here on the bed of my machine and make sure I'm straight that way. You could also use a ruler that has some lines that you can line up with the bed of your machine. I've got this line right here lined up on right at the edge of my throat plate. Now that's only if the lines on your throat plate are actually straight. Some machines may not have an edge of their throat plate that is a straight line. Some of them are curved, so you want to be careful about that. But I know that's straight, and what I've done is line that up right against my needle, and I've dropped my presser foot where it's sitting on that ruler. Then I'm going to grab a marking tool that will mark on my painter's tape. I'm trying to keep that out of there without getting it on there. I want it to mark on my painter's tape. I'm going to come back this far. And I'm going to, no, I should have taken the fabric out of there, but I didn't. So I'm just going to draw a line with my Sharpie. You want a fine line because you're going to line up on that line to feed those other rectangles and squares through. So again, remember I want to make sure that I have alternating leaning pickets. So I'm going to feed one through this way, and all I'm lining up with is the point of the square, and I'm lining this point of the square on that line. And I'm just going to start feeding that through, and I just want to follow that line up through the needle, lining up the corner of that square. This is probably something that most of you have done before. So now I'm going to grab the next one, and it has to lean the opposite way. So I'm going to line that up. I'm going to start feeding that through. So this saves you the time it takes. I got to straighten that up. This saves you the time it takes to mark on each square. And if you've got a bunch of these to do, this is an efficient way to do it. You just want to be careful because you want it to be as precise as possible. So I'm going to go back to the one that leans left. I'm saying leaning left because the back end of my rectangle is on the left side of the center of my line. And I'm going to line up my square. We're going to line up the point with the line that I drew on my painter's tape. And I'm just following that point up that line. Now this one has to lean to the right. The end of the fabric has to be going to the right. And I can just add those squares on as I feed the rectangles through. There's my point of my square. Now if you want to sit and mark a line on all of your squares, that's perfectly fine. That works just fine. In fact, that's the way the Pickets and Quickets instruction sheet will tell you to get that line marked. But if you're careful, you can draw the line on a piece of painter's tape on the bed of your machine and feed through your rectangles one after the other. You just want to make sure that you have one leaning left and then one leaning right and go back and forth like that. So I just fed through 8 rectangles going back and forth. That's all I need for the project. So I'm going to grab my fabric tag. Now these are oversized, so they're going to get trimmed, and I'm going to stack them up. And I typically stack them up with the direction, all the rights together and all the lefts together. You don't have to do that, but that way I can quickly tell with this block, I have 4 leaning left and 4 leaning right, which is what I need for my block. So we're going to take this to the ironing board, and we're going to talk about your options for how you trim away the excess, how you press it, and how you trim it to the right size. So we're going to just move this over. You are going to want the wing clipper tool, so I have that here, and I've got my ironing area ready. Now, there are 2 ways to look at this. I can either cut the excess of my seam away now, like that. Let me get one of each, just so you can see. But I would caution you, if you cut this away now, make sure you're cutting on the right side of that square, because if you cut over on this side, you're going to cut away your rectangle. Ask me how I know that. I haven't done that in a while, but you want to make sure that you are cutting on the proper side. And then you can press it. It's still going to be trimmed to size. And I've just got my finger pressing done. I'll just set the iron on that. Another thing you could do, you have options. You could go ahead and press it with the square under there. It's oversized. It's going to get trimmed. Which side I got? I think I've got that side. So there's several different ways you can handle this. You want to make sure that you pick the way that makes the most sense to you and that you can do consistently. So these both have that excess fabric under the seam. At this point, you either have to grab a pair of scissors and trim away the excess, which that works. Some people like to do that because they can sit in their recliner and trim away the excess. So that's one option. And then this would be ready to trim. You can also press toward the rectangle. There are times when, for one reason or another, you want to press toward this piece. I didn't on any of mine. The other thing you could do, if you're drawing your lines on, you could actually line up your Quilter's Magic Wand, point to point, draw the first line on, draw a line on this side of it, and you could actually stitch on both of those lines. Then when you cut here, I'm just going to pretend that I stitched them, you would actually have a tiny half square over here that you could use for something else. And that's a good way to use up fabric so that you're not wasting the fabric that you're actually trimming away here. So that's an option as well. I'm actually not going to do that, but I did want to show you that. Some people like to work with miniatures, and they have enough room to be able to sew little triangles or little half squares out of their leftovers. So when you're trimming these excess triangles away, don't try to use the Quilter's Magic Wand. There's not enough room to protect your fingers if you use that as a cutting guide. So you want to grab something big enough that your fingers can stay out of the way of the cutter. And once you get this done, we're ready to press all of them. You also could press open, depending on how you're quilting or what color fabric you've used here. Some people might actually flip this over and press that seam open. I'm pressing everything toward the triangle, but that is a total personal preference. And once you get the excess trimmed away, then you can just stack them, and they pretty well stack the direction that they have to go. set the iron on that. And then if you're going to use the acorn pressing solution, now would be a good time to use that. And notice I typically stack up several because there's enough heat in the iron to give you the results you need from that acorn pressing pen. It's just got a starch type alternative product in there. Helps keep everything nice and flat, and you'll be amazed at how much flatter your seams are. So now we're going to use our wing clipper tool to cut our pickets and quickets. So you're going to pretend that there is a whole flying goose here pointing toward you. So this seam would line up with the seam on this side, and it would be pointing toward you, and you're going to line up on the appropriate line. Now this needs to be trimmed to 3.5 by 2 because this is a 1.5 by 3 inch finished unit. Let me get one that's already been trimmed. So you can see that's already been trimmed. There's the 3.5 line, there's the 2 line, and I've got the diagonal line that would be on the goose on this side lined up on this diagonal seam. And I can trim up and over. And then I'm going to turn 180 degrees. The 3.5 and the number 2 line are going on my cut edges. That puts part of that bold X on that diagonal seam. It also makes sure that this seam goes right down to the corner in the size that I'm making. So I have the appropriate picket to go in my project. So this is the same one. I'm going to grab one that's the opposite. So notice on this one, with the seam leaning the opposite way, it's actually going to line up on that long diagonal seam that goes for every size. But I also want to place this so that I have room around that 3.5 by 2 inch line to be able to get my rectangle underneath that window, the 2 by 3.5. So I'm going to cut up and over. That automatically puts the seam right into the corner the way I want it. Then turn 180 degrees. This time the 3.5 by 2 inch line are going on my cut edges, and the part of the X, the bold X, is going to still end up on that diagonal seam. So when I trim, I get the appropriate pair, a mirror image pair for my project. Now, of course, you can place these however you want in your block. Mine are placed this way. So when you do stitch this, you've got something you're matching up right here. That also could play into how you want to press this. I don't worry too much about it, but I am going to stitch this just so you can see where I would pin and what I would pin. I also would need to make sure that here it's pinned appropriately so that this point and this point match up. And I'll just show you what that would look like. So any questions? I'm just keep talking and nobody's interrupting me, and Tony hasn't said somebody needs a question answered. So, okay, so she says everybody's a good student. This is what I want to arrange for my piece. So I need to make sure this point needs to match up along that seam. So I'm just going to line this up, and there, the intersection where those two seams cross, that intersection needs to actually line up with the intersection of this seam under here. So I'm going to just do a little tweaking, get that lined up. And once I have that pin, my placement pin, inserted in the proper place, I'm just holding on to it with my fingertips, and I grab another pin and slide that in. Then you can pin the corners if you need to. It's always perfectly fine to pin. I don't pin a lot, mainly because I'm always in a hurry, but sometimes it really helps your precision. So I'm just going to go right down the edge here, and I should be able to hit that intersection where those two lines of stitching come across to form an X. When you get to your pin, if you're going to stitch over your pin, slow down so you don't jam your machine up, because generally I'm right before the pin with my needle. If you go slow enough, your needle will deflect on the pin and you won't have any problems. If you go zooming across there, a lot of times your needle will grab that pin and somehow it hits it dead on. So I'm going to, I've lost my scissors. Just going to park my needle. And of course I would need to do this 4 times because I have 4 sides that have these pickets. Now at this point you have to decide, are you going to press this open? Are you going to press to the side? And notice that intersection comes right together, and I'm going to choose pressing open for this particular block. So once you finger press that open, you would see that those 2 points come together. Now I want to grab the opposite so that I get that mirror image on either side of that square squared, and it's going to line up. And I'm going to flip it over so that I can pin from the side that has the 2 diagonal lines of stitching. So my pin's going in right at that intersection, and it lined up perfectly on the seam on this side. You can't really see it because it's not focusing. There it went. It's lined up right on that seam, and I'm just holding that placement pin in place. Grab another pin and slide that in, and then I can make sure that my corners are going to stay locked together. And I'm ready to stitch. And I like to stitch from the side that has the square squared on top where I can see it, because I want to line up right on that intersection where those 2 lines of stitching. Also, you may need to use your seam ripper or your bent tip tweezers or stiletto if you use them, so that you make sure all of those seams stay flat as you go across them. I tend to always have a seam ripper close by, and I have a pair of bent tip tweezers at every machine, because I can use them to manipulate my fabric and slide them through, and they can even go right between the toes of my presser foot, and I can keep from hitting my needle with it. So it's pretty handy. So we're going to line that up, park our needle, and again I'm going to press open, and I'm just going to finger press right now and see how we did with our seams lining up. Pretty good. So that's where you want to line up, where this seam comes with that. Now I'm going to grab the center unit. Now if this seam doesn't line up pretty much the same, you got a problem, because this should measure 6.5 inches and this should measure 6.5 inches. If it doesn't, you probably need to adjust your seam allowance. I'm going to sew this side just so you can see it better. But this intersection and this intersection needs to match up. So I'm going to flip to this side so you can see a little better. I'm going to insert my pin right at the intersection where the 2 lines of stitching come together, and then I'm going to peek under here and insert my pin right at that intersection on the underside. So that's where it should fit. And I've just got my placement pin held in place. I'm going to just grab a pin and slide it in. And then I want to make sure that that seam stays open, so I can grab a pin and just make sure that that seam doesn't flip on me. And I'm going to grab another pin and lock the corners. Do the same thing over here where I press that seam open. I want to make sure that those 2 sides of my seam allowance don't flip on me, and then I've got the first part of my corner that's going to go through. And of course I would be doing all of these at the same time, but I'm just going to do this one seam so you can see it. So right here is where that seam is pressed open. Get down here where you can see it. You want to make sure that that doesn't get flipped up on you, and so I can feel that with my fingertips, that that seam is still laying flat. If you're concerned about sewing over pins, just stop and remove your pin and keep going. I want to make sure that this intersection is where my needle comes across. And when you get to there, sometimes I just grab the head of the pin and make sure that it keeps feeding through. There's my other open seam that I want to make sure it still lays flat. We're going to just remove my pin, and then the last part of this seam goes through my needle, and I'm going to grab my fabric tag and part my needle. And I am also going to choose to press open on this seam, and I'll show you why. So the intersection here where the two seams crisscross is where I went across. And if I've pinned properly, it's in the same place on the opposite side. So let's see how it turned out. That's what I'm after. Let me move the camera so you can see it. I want those 2 points to be matching up exactly, which is what I have. Then I'm going to press open. If you're pressing open, you're going to need to turn it over and do your finger pressing from the back side. So we're going to go to the overhead so you can see what that looks like. So I would continue adding the these units, put all of the pickets on the square squared, and then I would sew my whole block together. And I'm just setting the iron on there, letting the iron get those seams nice and flat. Then I'm going to just give it a quick swipe on the back side with my acorn pressing solution. I love this cordless iron, but it doesn't stay hot because if I don't remember to touch it to get it to come back on, it's actually not as hot as it really needs to be. But that's what I'm after, where those two seams come together. When I'm pressing open, I'll press from the back so that I know the seams are going the way I want them to. Then I flip it over and press from the front to make sure everything lines up. So that's how I would put that on there. And of course you would add the other side, and then this has some plain squares in the corners to make the block. Okay, any questions? All right, so next week we'll be doing, I don't remember the block number, 52 I think, might be 53. Because remember, we're skipping the blocks that are, sparkler is the next one. We're skipping the blocks that won't easily make a 12-inch block, and we're skipping any of the blocks that use the specialty star tools. So until next week, happy sewing. Come see us. We've got lots of wonderful fabrics for you, and we have new patterns and books that come in all the time. So happy sewing. We'll see you next week live at 5.